So I'm going to go through a short lesson over photosynthesis, and then at the end I'm going to try and walk you through that worksheet that I handed out in class. So the process of photosynthesis is taking the sun's energy and converting that into food energy. Our autotrophic organisms that are like plants and algae, they're going to perform photosynthesis. There are other organisms that don't have access to sunlight deep in the ocean around these hydrothermal vents, and they actually do a process called chemosynthesis. So they're able to get energy from one chemical form and then transform that into a food energy form. What we're going to be looking at is the process of photosynthesis, where plants and algae are utilizing pigments that help capture that solar energy. And the primary pigment that they're using is chlorophyll. Although when we do that photosynthesis lab, we see that there were also pigments within our leaves that we were testing. We could see pigments of carotene and xanthophylls along with the chlorophyll A and B. So you will need to know the chemical formula for the photosynthetic reaction. So make sure that you practice this. You will have to write it out as well as answer questions. The reactants will be on the left side of the arrow. This is what you're starting with. And the products will be on the right side of the arrow. And this is what is being produced in the reaction. So normally we write the sunlight over the top of the arrow, but sometimes you'll see it at the beginning. What this is doing or showing is that the same number and kind of atoms that you started with, the reactants, you're going to end up with. They're just going to be in a different arrangement. So you have 6 carbons that you started with in carbon dioxide. We're going to see that there are still 6 carbons after the reaction, but now it's stored in glucose. There are 12, 6 times 2 is 12, plus another 6 is 18 oxygens that we were beginning with. And then after the reaction, we can see here's 6 times 2 is 12, plus this 6, we still have 18 oxygens. It's just in a different arrangement. Our hydrogen number is 12 to begin with, and it's 12 at the end. So our glucose is that C6H12O6. When we think about the last chapter, and we learned the cellular respiration process that happens in the mitochondria, this formula looks to be just like the opposite process. So the formula is opposite. However, the reactions are not, they're not the same. They're not just like a reversal of reactions. They actually happen in 2 totally different organelles. Photosynthesis will happen in the chloroplast, and cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. So if we look at a cross-section of a leaf, on the outer layer we have this kind of waxy layer called the cuticle. We have these middle layers that contain all of these green chloroplasts filled with chlorophyll, and this is where photosynthesis will take place. There are structures called xylem, and they're basically an arrangement of cells that act like a series of tubes that will help transport water. There are other structures called phloem that also are a series of tubes that help transport glucose, or the food molecules that are produced after photosynthesis. There are also these structures on the underside of leaves called stomata These are openings that allow the oxygen to be released and the CO2 to be taken in. So we've got to have water that's brought up from the roots that'll move through the xylem to this photosynthetic layer of the leaves. We have to have carbon dioxide that is captured from the air, but it's also a byproduct of the cellular respiration process that leaves and plants also have to be performing at the same time they're doing the photosynthetic process. Next, we have the chloroplast, and these stacks of little disc stacks are called granum. They contain these thylakoids, each individual one, and the outer layers here are called the thylakoid membranes. This area within the inner membrane is called the stroma. So when we're looking at photosynthesis, part of the reaction will take place in the thylakoid membranes, and part of the reaction will take place in the stroma of the chloroplast. So when light reaches a surface, it's either going to be absorbed, transmitted, or reflected. When we see a color, like for example a red shirt, what we're seeing is red light that's being reflected, and the other wavelengths are being absorbed. We are only able to see a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, that light energy that is coming in from the sun, and that portion of the spectrum is called the visible light spectrum. We can separate that out when we look through a spectroscope, or if we use a prism or something like that, it'll separate the wavelengths, and we can see the colors of the rainbow. We can see those different wavelengths. When we're looking at a wavelength, is just the distance between two peaks. And what we see is as we increase wavelength, we see a decrease in energy. And as we decrease the wavelength, as it gets smaller and smaller, we have an increase in energy. So we have some photosynthetic pigments in chlorophylls A and B and within the carotenoids, and they're able to absorb some very specific portions of visible light. So if we look at our image here, we can see that this chlorophyll A is able to absorb these kind of purple and blues. And then our chlorophyll B and our carotenoids, right, we're seeing more of, kind of this blue-green area. And we can also see that it will absorb down here on this other portion of the spectrum, but it reflects this back out. These colors, these green colors, are being reflected back out, and that's what we're observing. That's what we're observing when we see those green leaves. Let me fix this there. So photosynthesis, think photo refers to the light capturing, and synthesis refers to the producing of a carbohydrate. Well, within photosynthesis, there are two sets of reactions, the light reactions and then the Calvin cycle reactions. The light reactions will capture the solar energy. The Calvin cycle reactions will make the carbohydrates. Okay, so our first step, this step right here, is the light reaction step, or the light reactions. There's actually two reactions that occur. And what happens is we get our solar energy, we have our light reactions that take water and break that down into oxygen, transfer the hydrogens to these escort molecules, these NADP molecules, and carry those hydrogens over to the Calvin cycle. Then the ADP plus P will get converted to ATP, and that ATP is needed in the Calvin cycle. The second part of our reaction is the Calvin cycle. And in this part of the reaction, we're starting with carbon dioxide. We're going to go through a series of chemical changes, and utilizing this ATP and the hydrogens and the carbon dioxide, we're going to start the process of forming glucose. So we don't have the complete molecule at this stage, but we will end up with glucose. So that's what this is showing. This is happening in the stroma. The light reaction is happening in the thylakoid membranes. The light reaction is taking the water, splitting that, getting some ATP. The oxygen is being released, or forming ATP. The oxygen is being released. The hydrogens are being carried to the Calvin cycle. The carbon dioxide is taken in. Oops. And the hydrogens are joined to that with the energy, utilizing the energy from the ATP. That ends up forming our basis for glucose. And then that NADP escort is just recycled and reused in the light reaction. And the ADP plus P is also reused. And when the next molecule of water comes through, that ATP can be formed again. So in the light reaction, there are actually two steps. And unfortunately, they're named out of order because of the way that they were discovered. So the first step will be photosystem 2, and the second step will be photosystem 1. The sun's energy comes down, hits the pigment complexes, and this energy splits our water molecule. So we're separating our hydrogens from our oxygens. The electrons, because remember, our hydrogen is one proton plus a little electron out here. So when we lose that electron, we end up with just these hydrogen ions. Well, we had two H2O, so we have two hydrogen ions and two electrons. Those electrons end up being passed down, or what's called an electron transport chain. And remember, that's a series of molecules within the membrane. In this case, it's within the membrane of the chloroplast. When we looked at cellular respiration, it was in the membrane of the mitochondria. So the electrons get passed to this next photosystem, and the energy causes the electrons to kind of get energized, and they end up moving and attaching to NAD+. The hydrogen ions also attach, so now we have those electrons and protons back together. We have this NADPH, and this will go to the Calvin cycle. This series of, when the electrons are moving down the electron transport chain, that provides the energy to build this ATP molecule, which then will also move to the Calvin cycle. So remember, the Calvin cycle is going to take these hydrogens and carbon dioxide, and it's going to build that glucose molecule. Okay, so this is a cross-section of the chloroplast, and you can see it has this bilipid membrane, and there are molecules embedded in that membrane. We have photosystem 2 with the pigments here. We have the electron transport chain, and then photosystem 1 with pigments here. So again, we're taking our water. The electrons are going to go through the electron transport chain. The hydrogen will go into the thylakoid space along with the oxygen. And then these hydrogen ions are building up on the inside of this thylakoid space. And as they move through ATP synthase, they are able to provide the energy to build ATP. So then our NADPH is able to attach the hydrogens and form, or NADP reductase is used to attach the hydrogen to NAD plus and produce this NADPH, which will then be passed over to the Calvin cycle. So you have a similar diagram on the handout I gave you in class. These little stacks of disc are called granum. The space inside the inner membrane is the stroma. The membrane where the light reactions occur are called the thylakoid membranes. And in that light reactions, we're going to produce our oxygen, ATP. We're going to carry off our hydrogens to the Calvin cycle. And ultimately, we're producing a molecule that will become glucose. I don't want you to be too concerned about all the different steps here in this picture. I just wanted you to see that there are these series of reactions that are taking place that are putting our carbons, adding our carbons together so that we end up with this glucose molecule at the end of the Calvin cycle. So again, you can see that here's our reactions for our chemical formula for photosynthesis and our chemical formula for cellular respiration. You want to make sure that you can write those formulas. You can tell me what the reactants are and what the products are, and you can tell me where those processes occur. Okay, so from our lab today, you should have concluded that the plant is able to do photosynthesis as well as cellular respiration. It utilized the carbon dioxide when it was doing photosynthesis, and we were doing the experiment in the light. We could see that carbon dioxide go down. And then when we shut the light off and we just were showing the cell respiration, you could see that CO2 was building back up again. So this last slide just shows a good summary of both the photosynthesis process and the steps, and then the cellular respiration process and the steps. So make sure that for the lab exam on Thursday, we're just going to be asking you questions about the labs that we've done. But for the unit exam on Monday, you need to make sure that you know the different steps for both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and you know what is going into that step and then what is being produced, what the products are for each step. So I will make a second video going over the handout that I gave you in class. But for now, you should be able to take some notes, and you can probably answer most of the questions within that handout just from this lecture.